Good morning, everyone. Good morning to everyone who's with us, and also very importantly, good morning to everyone who's following us via the Bruegel website. Thank you for joining us today for this very special event commemorating Bruegel's 20th anniversary. Now, I have to say, 20th anniversary makes me feel a bit old, because Bruegel is almost half my age. But also, at the same time, it also shows how far Bruegel has come, and it feels like Bruegel has been around forever, inspiring us and becoming one of the leaders in Europe when it comes to economic policy. And long may it continue to deliver research of the highest quality for the next 10, 20, 30 years to come. My name is Jonathan. I'll be leading the discussions today. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker, the Honourable Minister, Clyde Caruana.
Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. I have to say that it is a privilege for Malta to host this important Bruegel anniversary conference in view of your 20th birthday. As we gather here today, Europe faces a moment of profound challenge and profound choice at the same time. On our eastern borders, Russia's aggression continues to cast a shadow of fear across the continent. Governments are rightly responding by strengthening their defenses and supporting their allies. Yet, even as we rise to meet these threats, we must guard against creating new ones from within. Threats born not from foreign aggression, but of growing inequality, social division, and the erosion of trust in the Union itself. Europe's welfare state is more than just a set of policies. It is part of our identity, a promise that growth and prosperity will be shared and that no one will be left behind. But this promise now is under significant strain. In the upcoming EU budget negotiations, there will be difficult conversations about how to balance new defense spending with long-standing commitments like cohesion policy, which support development and convergence across the Union. If we are not careful, we risk financing security at the expense of solidarity. Greater defense spending is necessary in today's geopolitical climate, but if it comes at the cost of dismantling our social safety nets, we may find that we have won battles abroad only to lose the peace at home. At times, I find myself at a loss of why Europe is not recognizing the fact that its strength is directly linked to the strength of each national government within each member state. At a time where around us nationalism is on the rise, Europe finds itself with ever weaker governments. And I think you know what I mean, and I don't need to elaborate further on this. In short, rising inequality and social unrest could undermine the very European project that we sought to defend throughout the decades. This brings me to the first theme of today's conference, the design of our new fiscal governance framework. The framework we have today is fresher, more flexible than the one we had during the Eurozone crisis. It gives each member state the path to fiscal sustainability, while recognizing that each member state has unique circumstances. But rules, no matter how well designed, are not an end in themselves. At the end of the day, they remain tools. Tools that give governments the credibility with markets and citizens alike. Tools to create the fiscal space we need for priorities like investment in innovation, the green transition, and yes, of course, defense. They must be applied with balance, strict enough to avoid reckless spending, yet flexible enough to respond to crisis and invest into our future. When these rules were conceived, we could not fully foresee the world that we're living in today. A world of war on Europe's borders, fragmented global supply chains, rapid technological change, and intense competition both on the Western and the Eastern front. This is why we must be vigilant. Rules designed for yesterday's problems cannot blindly be applied to today's realities. Fiscal frameworks must evolve, not just to ensure stability, but to actively support competitiveness and resilience. Without sufficient public and private investment, Europe risks falling behind in innovation and productivity. And if we fall behind economically, we also weaken our capacity to defend ourselves and our way of life. For small open economies like Malta, the stakes are especially high. We are deeply integrated into global trade and capital movements. Confidence is indispensable. Fiscal rules help us to build that confidence, to make sure that investors know that we are credible partners. But credibility is a double-edged sword. If rules are too rigid, they can limit our ability to act in the face of sudden shocks, whether a pandemic, a financial crisis, or a geopolitical conflict. Rigidity can be another enemy of credibility. Small economies need agility as well as discipline. This is why dialogue ensures in finding the necessary balance between the reassurance and the rules that empower it. All economies in Europe are individually small in a global context. As an economist, more so than the hat that I wear as a minister, I believe deeply in fiscal responsibility. Malta has set itself an ambitious goal to bring its deficit below the 3% and at the same time lower its debt to GDP ratio towards 40% of GDP. But fiscal consolidation must be done gradually and thoughtfully. If we cut too fast, we're choking the very growth that sustains our welfare state and creates the revenues we need for the future. At the onset of the war between Ukraine and Russia, I said that this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. That's why the measures that we have enacted some 3 years ago have to be sustained for the long run. It's no coincidence, therefore, that Malta has been enjoying the highest growth rate in the Union for the past years. The goose that lays the golden egg must be nurtured and not sacrificed. Hence why the gradual and sustained reduction in the deficit has permitted us to retain growth while at the same time adhering to the rules. Fiscal responsibility does not mean austerity. We have proven that it can go hand in hand with social and economic progress. Ultimately, the question before us is not just technical, it is profoundly political. The choices we make in designing and applying fiscal rules will determine what kind of Europe we hand in to the next generation. Definitely, we must mobilize capital, both public and private, to finance the green transition, digital innovation, and of course defense. We must complete the capital markets union to channel Europe's vast savings into productive investment. And we must do so whilst protecting the social model that has made Europe what it is today. If we succeed, Europe will emerge a stronger continent that is secure, competitive, and united. If we fail, however, we risk a cycle of stagnation, inequality, and division. In the end, our task is simple to state, but hard to achieve: to keep Europe safe, prosperous, and fair. Defending our values and our way of life is as important as defending our borders from aggression during these dangerous times. Fiscal rules, therefore, must be an instrument that make both possible: stability and solidarity, and security together with social justice. As we debate today, let us remember that rules are only as strong as the vision they serve. And let that vision be of a Europe that inspires hope, protects its people, and stands resilient in a turbulent world. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your intervention. So, we're gonna kick things off this morning. And as you know, today's topic is very befitting an event of such magnitude. We're talking about the EU fiscal rules and the reform that was enacted April of 2024, so almost a year and a half ago. And what's been interesting is, of course, the Minister mentioned there's increased flexibility, there's a greater focus on individual country reports. But what's been also interesting is, since then, we've had quite a bit of debate over whether the rules are indeed fit for purpose, whether they encourage investment or potentially stifle it. And these are the things that we're going to be discussing today. And I think what's been interesting to look at is that since that time, so since April of 2024, the context has changed significantly. A lot has happened in Europe and I guess globally. You know, geopolitical changes have been dramatic. Security issues, of course, have become really very, very prominent in Europe. Technology always changes. That's a never-ending thing. The real threat of climate change is upon us. Maybe one day we used to talk about it as being something of the future. We are now living through it. And so we need to grapple with the context that we are living in and understand whether those rules, even rules which were there just a year and a half ago, are still fit for purpose and sustainable, because that's always a very key word with all of these things that we're talking about. Sustainable in all its guises: economic, social, environmental, etc. And so today, these are the main topics that we are going to be talking about. We have three main themes. We've got three panels, very interesting speakers, very diverse backgrounds. And the three main topics I'm going to be talking about today are, first of all, why did we need a fiscal reform? And is it actually hitting its stated ambitions? The second topic is going to focus more on the actual implementation of these rules. How have they been implemented in the real world? And what are the key tensions that we're already seeing over the last year and a half? And then the third session will look at small open economies. How do the fiscal rules apply to small open economies? Are they fit for them? Is there a one-size-fits-all policy, which we always hate mentioning? But is there also inbuilt flexibility? And I think what the Minister mentioned is very important, is rules. When you hear the word rules, I mean, let's face it, you feel a bit sick almost. Rules are not exactly the most exciting thing. And unfortunately, over the last few years, the words Europe and rules have become synonymous with one another, you know, kind of like Trump and tariffs. But it's not just rules. There's a lot more to unpack, and that's why we've got three sessions where we have much time as we want. Well, could probably do with more time as well to unpack all of these issues. Okay, so now just a few house rules. First of all, turn your phones off. That's very important so that we can all enjoy the debate, and please also participate. I will call up each speaker one by one. I will introduce them, then we'll have their intervention, and then we'll open the floor to discussions. And obviously I am very much looking forward to leading these discussions, but not just their interventions. I want your questions as well. We want this to be as interactive as possible because we really believe that your insights can add a lot of value to our understanding of this rather complex issue and maybe help us to chart a way forward for reform. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with session number 1. Our first session, as I already mentioned, will look at the origins of the fiscal reform. Why did we need a reform? And where we're at in terms of how are we hitting our ambitions? Because something that's very important, I will remind you of the ambitions of this reform. If you read the ambitions of this reform, they're very, very ambitious. They're a tall order because they talk about increasing credibility, increasing fiscal discipline, flexibility, but also being adaptable to countries, promoting long-term sustainability. These are lofty ambitions. So we need to look at where we're at and obviously given our context and see our progress. And I think it's going to be an interesting discussion because you can have all the lovely ambitions you want, all the lovely targets, but where are we in the real world? So where are we in the division between ambition and application? And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So in this first session, I will invite the speakers up. So we've got Dr. Moira Catania, who's the chairperson of the Malta Fiscal Council. And we've got Professor Eckhard Janeba from the European Fiscal Board and the University of Mannheim. You've got your mic. So I will start with you, Dr. Catania. So obviously the new EU fiscal governance framework promotes national ownership of rules. That's a very important point. And it's reflected, I guess, in the more country-oriented, sort of country-specific reports and the approach. So how does the new framework, in your opinion, take into account specific circumstances of EU member states? Have we really moved on from one size fits all? And is the framework actually contributing towards greater national ownership and then hopefully compliance with the rules?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting debate on the EU fiscal governance reform. I'll start by saying why national ownership is important. Okay, so national ownership is important because national ownership implies commitment to the EU fiscal rules, and therefore one would expect more compliance with the rules. And in the EU setting, okay, so this is more important because the Stability and Growth Pact is a supranational rule, and one of the main weaknesses of this framework has been the difficulty to have enforcement on sovereign states. So that's why national ownership and commitment to the rules at the national level is very important. And this has been one of the main aims of the reform that was adopted last year. However, it's not a new concept. So even the previous reform or the previous package of reforms that were implemented during 2010 to 2013 in response to the euro area sovereign debt crisis, they also tried to have more national ownership, but sort of the strategy or the approach to increase national ownership was different. So at the time, the idea to increase national ownership was by decentralizing the rules. So rather than having only EU fiscal rules, there was the obligation through the Fiscal Compact Treaty that member states, at the time the euro area member states, would have to adopt at the national level rules that reflect the obligations of the Stability and Growth Pact, so the 3% deficit rule, the 60%, and also the obligation to have an annual structural adjustment of 0.5 percentage points per year. And there was also the obligation for member states, again, to establish at the national level independent fiscal institutions like the Malta Fiscal Advisory Council, which I chair, with among its mandate, its task was to monitor and ensure compliance with the national fiscal rules, but also with the EU fiscal rules. So there, the strategy to have more national ownership was by decentralizing the EU fiscal rules. With this reform, the approach is a bit different. So those remain, so these obligations remain there, that we need to have national fiscal rules that reflect the obligations, and that the National Fiscal Council has to monitor compliance with the national rules and also with the EU rules. But there has been more, so the idea to have more national ownership has been by having more of a country differentiated approach, so that the targets, the fiscal targets that the national governments have to follow, they are country differentiated. So we do no longer have the one-size-fits-all that each country has to reduce the debt ratio by 1/20, for example. That applied across the board. So now with this reform, so there's the debt sustainability analysis, so it's a risk-based approach which takes into account country-specific characteristics. So the initial debt level, potential output growth, cost of aging, and from this exercise, there's one indicator that is the sole indicator for monitoring and compliance, the net primary expenditure growth, that is derived but is individual for each member state. So this, I think, is a very important development, because now the targets are reflecting the specific circumstances of the member states. And if we look at the expenditure, so the maximum expenditure growth that was proposed by the European Commission, we see that there's quite a large variety in these targets. So some countries have been proposed quite a restrictive target, like, for example, Italy, with the maximum growth in this indicator, expenditure growth, being just 1.5%. But then you have other countries, like Malta, for example, where the target is 5.9%. So this variations, I think, shows the importance that we have a country differentiated approach, because surely a one-size-fits-all expenditure target would not have been appropriate, because it's apparent that countries have very different characteristics and trajectories for debt sustainability. So I think this was a very important step to have more national ownership, because now the target is more reflecting the needs and the requirements of the individual member states. So I think this was a very important development. A second, I think, also important part of the reform was also procedural. So the way that the targets are set. So the approach is more of a partnership approach. In a way, I think it's similar to what was applied also with NextGen EU and the Recovery and Resilience Plan and the agreement on the commitments there. So the Commission issues what is known as a trajectory, which is defined as described as prior guidance. So it's not that the target is imposed centrally from Brussels on the member states. So the Commission sort of proposes this target based on this debt sustainability analysis, taking into account country-specific characteristics, and then there's a dialogue, a technical dialogue with the member states. And member states can adopt this trajectory proposed by the Commission, they can adopt a more restrictive one, or they can make arguments for allowing a bit more leeway. And in fact, this is what we've seen also what has happened in the first round. So the procedure was that there was this prior guidance by the Commission in the beginning of summer last year, and then there was this technical dialogue, and then member states published what is known the medium-term fiscal structural plan. And then this was again reviewed by the Commission and finally adopted by Council, which would be the trajectory that member states have to follow. And if we see what has happened, we see that some countries have adopted the prior guidance of the Commission. So they considered that this was an appropriate fiscal strategy for their country. That includes Malta, Italy, for example. There were countries that went beyond that decided to be even more ambitious and adopted targets that were more restrictive, so lower growth and expenditure than the Commission was sort of allowing. This includes, for example, France. And then there were other countries that proposed or made arguments for more leeway. And they proposed higher expenditure growth than the Commission was proposing, and this was endorsed by Commission and eventually Council. So we see that there was, again, country differentiation and also flexibility, and that this partnership worked. And the difference is also when the Commission and eventually Council endorsed this sort of more flexibility in expenditure growth was quite significant. For some countries, it was around 1 percentage point annually. So it shows that the framework, the procedures in which it is implemented, they also it allows flexibility at the national level. Another aspect of more country differentiation is the fact that the framework allows countries to move beyond the 4 years and have an extended period of adjustment of 7 years if they commit to certain investment and reforms. So again, this is an element of where you do not have a one-size-fits-all, and you have a number of countries that have, I believe, 5 or 6 that have gone for this extended framework. I will not go a lot into detail because I think that this will be covered in the next part of the discussion. So overall, I think, yes, the new fiscal framework has tried to have more national ownership through this country differentiated approach, both in terms of the targets and also in the procedures used, sort of, let's say, allowing negotiations and some leeway in the setting of the targets. So we've moved away clearly from a one-size-fits-all regime. Have we moved completely away from this? In my opinion, no. Why? Because the fiscal governance, or the form of fiscal governance that is embedded in the fiscal framework, remains one that is based on a rules-based system. So it involves having rules and having commitment of the budgetary decision makers to these rules. But this is not the only form of fiscal governance. So in the literature on budgetary institutions, basically there are 2 forms of fiscal governance. One is this rules-based approach, which is also known as the contracts approach, that has been sort of the core of the EU fiscal framework despite the various reforms. But there's another reform that is based more on the procedures of the budgetary process, that focuses more on the role of different players, of this different decision makers. And this is called the delegation approach or the hierarchical approach. And in this fiscal governance form, you have more powers to the finance minister, during the part on budget negotiations vis-à-vis spending ministers, and also during implementation, so that you have more control and avoid expenditure slippages. But also during the budgetary approval stage, you have restricted amendment powers for Parliament. So here the aim is to centralize budgetary decision making. And again, in the literature, there has been a lot of debate that how important it is that the form of fiscal governance, so the system that is used to have fiscal discipline, reflects the political, social, and institutional setup of a country. And the rules-based approach, so what we have as an EU fiscal framework, is more appropriate for countries that have coalition governments, especially coalition governments that are made of partners with very different ideological views. Why? Because in such systems, obviously, the partners would not accept that they give strong powers to a finance minister who may be coming from a different political party. But on the other hand, when you have single-party majority governments or coalitions made up of partners that are very ideologically aligned, the delegation approach may be more appropriate. So, and even if we look at within the EU, we see that countries still have strong delegation characteristics. So in some countries, this type of characteristics of ensuring fiscal discipline remain important. So my personal opinion here, so not that of the Fiscal Council, but I'm wearing more the hat of an academic here, would be that there should be consideration also for different forms of fiscal governance, because it's not necessarily the case that a rules-based system may be appropriate for all countries or may be the best way, the more effective way to achieve fiscal discipline in all EU member states. I think I stop here for now, and I'll be willing to discuss further.
Fantastic. Thank you for your input. We'll go to Professor Janeba. So, Professor, as we know, fiscal rules are there to promote also fiscal discipline and credibility, stability, but we know they can also potentially constrain public investment, which, as we know, is extremely important even for Europe to reach its long-term goals on a variety of different areas, sustainability, on the environment, but also innovation and even defense, as we've been also hearing. So, Professor, from your research and from your experience, do you believe that the EU's new fiscal framework strikes that balance between credibility and flexibility to enable these types of investments? And what design features and safeguards would you recommend to ensure that fiscal rules don't just prevent or help to prevent crises, but also promote sustainable public investment?
Wow. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introduction and the invitation to come to Malta for this event. First of all, congratulations to Bruegel for a fantastic 20 years. I'm looking forward to another 20 or even more years of improving economic policy, as it is said. Yeah, so the subtitle of this session here is Why and How Reform Came About. And you mentioned already one. And when I was interviewed for the fiscal board position, the Commission asked me exactly that type of question. And I think I answered that there are a couple of issues with the old framework. One was that it tended to be pro-cyclical, even though it was not intended to be that way. But it's very difficult in real time to estimate the structural balance. The rules were complex and hard to manage and hard to understand. Third, I think there was an agreement that there's a lack of enforcement, or the credibility of the rules were suffering. And the fourth, and that's an issue that you mentioned, is the role of public investment, whether the old framework would sufficiently protect public investment. And that is the issue that I've been working on in my work in university, but also now in terms of the fiscal board. And let me answer that by first thinking about this from a conceptual point of view before I come to the new rules framework in more detail. Why do we have fiscal rules in the first place? Well, it is because we think that the political process has a tendency to focus on spending, current spending, so a present bias. And this present bias would lead to too much borrowing so that we shift spending into the present. And this is not to blame policymakers like our minister here, but rather it's a response to voters, right? I mean, it's us who are basically behind that. But it has this tendency that we spend too much in the current period relative to the future. This is the typical deficit bias that we know from the literature. But there is a second dimension to the very same bias. And that is that the mix of government spending is tilted, biased toward consumption spending away from investment spending. Precisely for the same reason, because consumption spending is a benefit today, whereas investment spending may deliver benefits in the future. So we have the typical problem of present bias is a twofold, an anti-investment and then a deficit bias. And I think there's evidence, or anecdotal evidence, and that comes from my home country, Germany. If you travel, maybe you take a flight through Frankfurt or you drive on German roads, and you will see this is in very bad shape. The German infrastructure is in bad condition. Whereas in the 2010s, Germany had fiscal surpluses many years in a very healthy economic situation. So this is some stylized evidence that there is a problem. Now, there are many issues why public investment in Germany was low. So I don't want to deny that, but this is evident of that. Now, you may say, well, aren't there all these studies that show that fiscal rules don't hamper public investment? And the answer is yes. The evidence is that many studies don't find negative effects on public investment. Most of them are rather neutral, have zero effect or non-significant effects. But this is not a contradiction to what I was saying earlier, right? Because what these studies do is to compare a world with fiscal rules and without fiscal rules. But my point is that present bias introduces an underinvestment problem where we should compare the first best world, where we don't have a present bias, which should be the normative benchmark, with the world in the second best world where we have a present bias. And so the empirical studies don't shed light on that. They just say the fiscal rules don't harm that, but it's not the same as saying we don't have an underinvestment problem. Now, theoretically, there's a solution to that. That's a golden rule, as many of you know. Of course, this is not easy to implement, and maybe that's the reason why the Stability Growth Pact is not a golden rule. I'm now switching towards from the conceptual issue to the real world. And so public investment in the Stability and Growth Pact, both in the old and in the new system, are emphasized a lot. But they are not an objective in itself, but rather public investment is seen as a way to indirectly promote economic growth and thereby lead to compliance with fiscal rules and to fiscal sustainability. So it's different whether I say I target public investment itself or whether I use it indirectly to satisfy fiscal rules. And in fact, if you look at Regulation 1263, our new framework that was mentioned already from April last year, I did a little search and I said, how many times is the term investment or investments, plural, mentioned in that regulation? 51 times. So it's not a lack of pointing to the importance of public investment. It shows up everywhere, right? Let me just mention it. It's mentioned in the requirement of the fiscal structural plan. It is mentioned when a member state is applying for an extension of the adjustment period. It is mentioned by the endorsement of the Council. It is mentioned in the case of non-compliance with the fiscal rules. It is mentioned in the annual progress report by the member state. And it is mentioned by the monitoring by the Commission. So it's all over the map. But will it lead to success? Will it work? That's, of course, an empirical question, and it's fairly early to judge that. But let me give a few indications why we should be concerned. One is the year 2024 itself. It was a transition year from the old system to the new system. And what did we see? In this year, the enforcement was basically lacking. There's basically kind of a gap year, if you say. What happened in member states? Well, we see that the expenditure growth accelerated quite dramatically in many member states. And in fact, it increased more on social spending, and there's nothing against social spending per se, but less so in public investment. In particular, in countries with debt to GDP ratios between 60 and 90%, this is very, very common. Okay. So in other words, we see I have a concern that public investment, as soon as is again suffering relative to other spending categories. If I look at my home country again, Germany, as you may know, we just passed a big reform package in Germany. Changing the fiscal rules, the constitutional fiscal rules, and we what now see in the implementation stage is exactly this. The government is shifting room from the core budget into the special fund that is designed for infrastructure and other public investment, reducing spending for infrastructure in the core budget and paying for this now from the special fund, which was meant to be additional public investment spending, right? So it's undermining basically the objective that public investment should be at the forefront. Let me comment briefly on defense spending, because I think this is, as was pointed out before, a very important category and dimension of our policy. We have seen now that the Commission invited member states to apply for the national escape clause earlier this year, and many member states have taken advantage of that, which would allow member states to have a 1.5 percentage point higher expenditure growth cumulative and measured relative to the 2021 benchmark. But this is somewhat of a problem in my view, not because it emphasizes defense spending. I'm totally in line with the minister that we need to spend more on that. But it is an exemption that makes not clear how we finance defense spending permanently. Mm-hmm. And this exemption for 4 years, it runs until 2028, is only a temporary fix. And the concern is that member states will not, do the kind of reforms that are necessary to finance permanently higher defense spending, and so that we will fall in a deeper hole in 2028 when we get rid of this exemption, or we extend the exemption, but then we have we are fudging with the fiscal rules framework again, and that's not a permanent fix. So let me stop here at this point, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So what we'll do now is we will open the floor to discussions. We'll have a mic that will go around. So please, just house rules, be concise. If there is someone in particular that you would like to address, please do so. If we'll have a few questions, I'll take a few, and then we'll sort of bunch them, and then we'll get the panel to react. So please go ahead. If there are any questions, raise your hands, and we have a mic going around. So we can start.
Thank you very much. I'm Joel Darvas from Bruegel. Very pleased to be here. So my question is about setting the net expenditure growth path. I have to say that I'm still very much an advocate of the current system. I think an expenditure rule is really have lots of beneficial properties compared to the previous structural balance rules. But what we also see in the application is that the way you set is, first of all, very tricky, but also rather controversial. Because the way it is set there's a fiscal adjustment requirement which is set in terms of a structural primary balance, and this is translated into a net expenditure growth. But this translation relies on future potential growth and on future inflation. And what assumptions national governments and the Commission make can make a big difference. Now, in particular for potential growth, the commonly agreed EU methodology sometimes leads to very strange results. For example, for just name France, according to the methodology, France had a potential growth over 1% in the recent years. It is expected to go down to less than 0.5% in the next 5 years, and then go up over 1.5% in 10, 15, 20 years from now, which is very strange. And also many other countries have such a very unusual profile. So in fact, the way this potential growth projection done is very crucial, and I'm afraid that the EU methodology is not settled enough. But the other, also the inflation assumption can be very crucial, which typically uses from the Commission side a projection from country experts for the next 2 years, and then use market expectations for 10 years ahead, and then gradually converges to the ECB 2% target. But again, what you assume for inflation is also absolutely crucial. So I wonder what your view is whether this is the right approach to set the expenditure path, or you would have some alternative suggestions.
Perfect. I think given the depth of the question, we'll go straight to the panel. So.
Yeah, thank you. You raise a very important and difficult question. Mm-hmm. I think that you described correctly, right, the trend, how we go from one to the other, from the structural primary balance to the net expenditure growth. And that's why the new system is kind of facing some of the problems the old systems had as well, right? Because we need to estimate, as you pointed out, the potential growth and the inflation rate. Now, you could say, okay, then just determine an expenditure growth path not linked to these values, but you have to link it somewhere also to make it kind of a transparent and replicable process. So I think you cannot avoid benchmarking it somewhere. And so then, of course, the question comes up, how do you benchmark or how do you calculate potential growth? And I share with you the concern. Again, looking at the German case, we discussed it just before we met here on the podium. So Germany is now assuming that it jumps in 2025 to a much higher potential growth rate in its fiscal structural plan and has a higher inflation rate, which seem above what most economists would think would be appropriate. So the Commission accepted that. So it's two things, right? It's one is how do you come up with these numbers, but second then what's how do we accept it? Does the Commission accept it? Does the Council accept it or not? I think so. I don't have an easy fix for that, but I share your concern.
If I may add, so my response is very similar to yours. So it's not a perfect system, obviously. It still depends on assumptions for potential output growth. I think an improvement is that in the previous system, there was also the issue that you had to estimate adjustment before and then ex post it may turn out very, very different. So that was quite a concern. Also, the agreement obviously is a compromise. So the 3% deficit, the 60%, those were not changed because those require treaty revision, and I'm sure that nobody wants to go there at the moment. But also in terms of the the linking through the structural adjustment, and even for countries that are subject to excessive deficit, that was part of the compromise by ensuring the safeguards in the system. So yes, the expenditure path trajectory is very sensitive to different assumptions, but I think that also the fact that there is this room for technical discussion, and in the first round it's clear that when countries made arguments for different assumptions, so a different expenditure trajectory than that proposed by the Commission was endorsed at the end. I think that leaves a bit of a room for a technical discussion when the resulting assumptions, potential growth, inflation, etc., but also age-related expenditures. For example, in the case of Malta, we also had sometimes debate with the Commission, both on potential output growth, but also on the outlook projections for age-related expenditures, because they are very sensitive to what you were assuming for migration, for example. But I think leaving this room for a technical discussion, it allows some discussion when and the first round shows that the Commission has heard different views of the member states.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. So, any other questions? Maybe Kevin.
Thank you. Rather than a question, just a follow-up to your questions. From the practical point of view, what we see is that at least the new framework, whereas the old framework was based on the output gap, which had various problems in the estimation of the output gap, and it was very volatile. So it's very difficult to establish a clear target. This is more based, first of all, on potential growth, which is at least more stable than the output gap itself, even though they are related. So at least in terms of stability, the new framework we think is a very substantial improvement. Secondly, I think there is also underlying it the DSA framework, as you know, which rather than targeting the growth which is allowed by potential growth only, it also looks into each country's past, looking at also the volatility of growth and previous crises, and through those stochastic simulations, it actually targets a more prudent growth than the actual potential growth, depending on the past history and those stochastic simulations. So there's an additional buffer. So it's true. I mean, it's not perfect, I agree, but I think it's still a substantial improvement from the previous one.
Very good, thank you. If there are any reactions, perhaps?
Just to add one small remark, I think one part of the new regulation is to smooth the time series for potential growth, right? If this is unstable. And now you may say this is a good way of making adjustments because of this instability, but it also has meant that now this provision allows member states to, like Germany, to claim we jump immediately into this higher potential growth rate of 0.9, whereas most economists would think 0.5 is already, an optimistic value for the next coming year. So again, I think it's a framework that allows these things, and that's a concern. Even though in principle I agree, right? We should take into account these, looking into the past, what are the dynamics, and try to match these as closely as possible. Yeah.
A small
Yes, of course.
comment also. The new system, so you have the expenditure growth, which is fixed for 4 years, which is a positive thing in that there's stability, so there's commitment, so there's everyone knows what the targets are for the next four years. But if circumstances change during this 4-year period, then sort of there's uncertainty whether there can be an argument to change the commitments in terms of expenditure growth. So, for example, in the case of Malta, the potential output growth projections are quite high, and that obviously, and also the debt, the relatively low debt level, that allowed us, to have a relative, actually the highest expenditure growth allowed among the member states. But everything hinges on the potential output growth. So if something happens and potential output growth slows during this period, it means that we would have expenditure growth which is high, but which does not necessarily ensure that the projected debt trajectory would be achieved.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I think if not, then we can close this session. So I thank, obviously, our speakers. Give them a round of applause, please. Show our appreciation. And I think it's a really good way to start things off, trying to understand the origins, the challenges, and as we've seen also, there's quite a bit to unpack in terms of the methodology. Obviously, this is not simple. But I think something that was really interesting that sort of was alluded to in all of the speeches, and I think touches upon what the minister mentioned, is you can rewrite the rules as much as you want. There are, it's the easy part is to rewrite rules. But rewriting rules with a purpose is much harder. And it's extremely important that any reform, any fiscal reform, needs to be done with an overarching goal in mind, and especially in the EU context, the EU's long-term goals, whether they're green, innovation, productivity, all of these things. And therefore, we need to understand how these rules contribute towards the EU's long-term goals, and that is the benchmark also for success. Apart from then, even the methodological issues that we got into as well, which I think are part and parcel of when we get into these compromises. The compromise between flexibility and discipline. And that's always going to be there. And it's always going to be a challenge. So I thank my speakers once again, and we'll move on straight away to our second panel. So our second panel today is going to look at the actual implementation of the rules. We've had a year and a half-ish of the rules. How have they been implemented? And what are the main tensions that are already emerging? Are we seeing certain things that perhaps need tweaking? Because there's been a lot of debate. Even among Bruegel scholars, I've seen a lot of papers on this topic. It seems almost insane to talk about this, but in the year and a half that has preceded this implementation, a lot has happened in the world. Let's be diplomatic. The new US presidency has shifted the geopolitical and economic reality that we live in, even in terms of trade. A lot has happened. And there's been a lot of debate over whether we need a reform of the reform. That's already being talked about. And that is part of what we're going to talk about in this session now. So I'm going to introduce our amazing trio of speakers. We've got Dr. Zol Darvas, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. We've got Ms. Paula Fonseca Costa, Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Finance in Portugal. And we've got Mr. Sandro De Marco, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Malta. So, Dr. Darvas, I will start with you. So, in your June 2024 policy paper, you highlighted a key potential weakness of this fiscal framework, and that is that it could unduly constrain public investment, which obviously, as we know, is extremely important, even in light of, and you actually mentioned that it would be especially problematic unless we have a substantial increase in EU funding. And even as we've seen over the last year and a half, the Draghi report, which has become almost biblical in its importance with regards to competitiveness, and the criticism that Europe is not doing enough to mobilize resources to really push forward the competitiveness agenda. And so, looking at these developments since your paper, how do you now assess the risks that you had identified last year? Do you think that the EU is on track to address those risks? Or do you think that actually there's still a huge risk in terms of derailing large-scale investment?
Thank you. Thank you very much. My short answer is yes, there is a major risk. But let me elaborate it a bit more. So I think the Draghi report, I think, made a very important contribution. And many of you know that the Draghi report identified that Europe faces a so-called investment gap of around 4 to 5% of GDP annually in the coming years. That's an enormous amount. Now, this investment gap should be primarily filled by the private sector. I mean, lots of private investments, companies, but also households will have to do their bit. But there are also a significant component which must come from the public sector. And Draghi, in his report, didn't quantify how to divide this 4 to 5% investment gap between public and private investment needs. We had a paper in which we tried to do that, and we arrived at roughly 1/4, 1/3 should be done by the public sector, which means, over 1% of GDP might be even bigger. And again, the public sector can be also divided between the European Union budget and national budgets. Now, since July, the Commission proposed its proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework, and we saw a little increase in the overall amount of the EU budget, but most of this increase will go to financing the repayment cost of the debt which was borrowed by the EU to finance the next generation EU. Plus, unfortunately, there's a risk that member states will water down the Commission proposal. So I'm afraid that the EU budget will do relatively little to fill this investment gap. So it means that this extra 1.5% of GDP annual investment spending should be financed by national budgets. And I'm afraid we don't see that. So there's only one country where we see it, and it is Germany. As Professor Janabe mentioned, Germany introduced a special extra budgetary fund, but at the same time, you also mentioned that they are reducing their investment spending within their ordinary budget. So I wonder about the overall impact. But still, Germany plans to do a sizable investment push, which is good. This is what we wanted from Germany to do for a long, long time. But if you look at the aggregate of the 27 EU countries, so in a research we looked at how much these countries invested in 2024 and what their plans suggest they plan to do by 2028, so 4 years from now, which is a relatively long duration. And you see that on aggregate of the EU, the planned public investment increase is just 0.25%, so 0.25%. This falls well short of what we need from the public sector to invest more, to meet the investment gap, to help to fill the investment gap that Mr. Draghi has identified. And we also have to say that these are just plans, but many countries will have to implement fiscal consolidations in the years to come. And we know that, where countries have to decide, okay, whether I invest more in, supporting those green technologies, or, I cut this kind of social benefits or those housing support, or I cut the expenses that ministries can use for day-to-day spending. Then these choices are very, very difficult. And very often when fiscal consolidation happens, and in fact, investment is the first victim to cut, because investment is more for the future. I mean, future generations would not complain now, but if you don't increase pensions or you cut social spending, then pensioners or families will complain already now. So again, my main message is that the plans plan a relatively little aggregate at the EU 27 level, just a 0.25% increase in public investment as a share of GDP. And my fear that it will be even cut down and reduced during actual implementation. So this completes my answer to my more detailed answer to your question, that yes, I do see major risks that the public sector will not really contribute to filling the investment gaps that the European Union faces.
Thank you very much. So, Ms. Costa, short and simple, very much to the point, how can the new fiscal rules be improved? I think it actually tallies very nicely with the previous answer. And I guess, what's the way forward for fiscal reform in light of these challenges that the EU faces?
Okay, so thank you very much for your question. Also, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And let me start also with a small disclaimer. I will make a few comments that are really very much work in progress still in the context of the Portuguese Ministry of Finance. So this may not be the final decisions that the minister and the ministry will put forward. But indeed, let me start by saying that common EU fiscal rules are fundamental within the EU, and I think that the progress that we have been making in terms of the reform that was performed was indeed very positive. But indeed, we think that effective implementation of these common rules very critically depend on securing strong political backing from national governments. So indeed, this issue that was already mentioned, national ownership, is a key concept. So indeed, it very much relates to the democratic legitimacy that was already mentioned also, and obviously a fundamental condition for rules to be successfully implemented. And indeed, I think that governments then will be much more committed to adhere to the objectives if they indeed have this important role in defining how the objectives are indeed shaped. So indeed, as already was mentioned, we think that these differentiated budgetary efforts, the flexibility that allows also member states to react to symmetric and asymmetric shocks are very relevant, and also this focus on medium-term debt sustainability is indeed important elements of this new reform. One important also thing that we think it's quite useful is indeed this expenditure growth rule that allows us indeed to have one single operational indicator that we think it's also positive in terms of being more effective, more controllable, and also a visible tool for guiding this fiscal policy and also ensuring responsible budgeting over the medium term. So one comment I think it's important is that from the Portuguese perspective, this new framework is not less demanding compared to the previous one. I think that there were many concerns when we start our discussions that we would turn into a framework that could be less demanding, but from our perspective, that is not the case. Even if, as Professor told us in the previous session, that indeed now we have different approaches, and we have indeed governments being able to discuss with the Commission based on the Commission inputs different requirements. But indeed, we think that indeed it's important that excessively strict adjustment requires, or indeed shorter periods for adjustment, should not act at negative incentives for member states to comply with the framework, because obviously the credibility of the reform is important. It is something that we have also have been discussing. But indeed, more recently also, and going on top of the ongoing structural changes that Europe was already facing, so aging population, climate change, digitalization, the present economic landscape indeed poses new challenges that indeed were not foreseen when we were discussing the reform. And we have indeed geopolitical fragmentation, European defense needs, and also this new trade context that you already very diplomatic referred to. So indeed, the framework indeed needs to be adaptable and allowing countries room to create necessary fiscal space to adhere to these important priorities. And one important element is that I think that we need to be very careful, because indeed we have to balance fiscal sustainability with indeed competing objectives, competing priorities that indeed basically they very much compete among each other for financing. So what can we do indeed to increase fiscal space, what we have been doing, trying to do essentially in Portugal within the context of the current rules? First of all, trying to improve public spending money in a smarter way. And indeed, some instruments can be implemented. For instance, we have been going through deep and regular spending reviews to ensure that every euro of tax money payers has a really positive impact. Also, we are developing with the IMF the public investment management. How to improve the public management investment is relevant. And also at the EU level, the Council has been discussing also these important practices because they indeed benefit creating additional fiscal space via these practices. I think that they are well recognized and have been also on our agenda. Then indeed also the need to strategically partner with the private sector. So basically very much here the well-managed public-private partnerships are important. So basically we have indeed to ensure that these partnerships do not become an excessive, with an excessive impact on public finances, but indeed it can bring public and private investment and also private expertise to public projects. And indeed it's also foster innovation and sharing the risk. We think that is important. But indeed, ultimately, what we have to do is indeed to shift our focus from just controlling costs also to boosting quality of our public finances. So we think that it's important to prioritize investment that fuel long-term growth, like energy, digitalization, also defense autonomy, and making indeed our economies more competitive and creating also jobs for the future. One last, in this context, one last word on defense. Indeed, we think that it's our consensus that the defense expenditure has to be increased. But we think it's important that member states can coordinate and develop specialized defense capabilities, and in each country, in order to allow us to increase our collective defense efforts also in a smart way. Indeed, try to avoid duplications, and again, smarter use of our resources. But indeed, for us, it has also been a concern that this increase on defense expenditure does not undermine the sustainability of public finances, and we think that reaching our defense targets has to be done within budgetary discipline. So also, public spending reprioritization by governments also remains essential to maintain public finances sustainability, but indeed I think that we need to recognize that all these will not be sufficient to accommodate the expenditure that governments indeed need to incur into. And as also already discussed, some changes to the economic governance framework could be indeed a way forward. I know here Bruegel has already made some proposals. As I told you, we are still internally also discussing the ones that have been presented. There are also some that we think it could be indeed thought through. First of them, allow member states to review the budgetary objective that they set, eventually every 2 years, basically needed based on the member states' requests, ensuring that indeed our goals remain realistic and achievable, and even if the economic landscape shifts. Then also we also have this emergency brake, so the escape clause. These also play an important role. Maybe here we could also try to elaborate a little bit further in order to have these clauses easily activated if necessary. We already have the example of the defense expenditure clause, which is also very relevant also in terms of this current context. It's an important boost for governments to comply with the requirements that are needed. Then this could be also relevant also in terms of helping member states dealing with unexpected events. We have these extreme weather events, natural disasters, also the surge in inflation, and sometimes also other severe economic shocks that we have been facing over the last decade, actually. So indeed, so I think this is also important. But my last point now deals a little bit how we can indeed deeper our EU instruments. We think that indeed, and the Portuguese authorities have been advocating the need to create the creation of the EU-level instruments, which I think it's very relevant because they are important to provide adequate responses to the challenges that the Union faces. So a permanent European budget capacity, this is something that has been discussed but never implemented. A permanent macroeconomic stabilization instrument to address shocks is also essential, and we think that this is very important because it reinforces the anti-cyclical nature of the existing budgetary rules. Because if indeed based solely on a national budgetary capacity, it is insufficient given the level of European integration and differentiated fiscal capacity and fiscal space, I would say, among member states. So then also common financing for common objectives, common financing of public goods. We think it's also relevant. In this context, we have had the Next Generation EU, which is a very important instrument, and in particular the recovery and resilience plans that member states are implementing. These are based on performance, how member states can indeed implement and can deliver. So I think these performance-based instruments are a positive experience. Also, as I already mentioned, the next multi-annual financial perspectives will be important. Also, the EU budget, we think it's a key instrument for the EU to deliver on its commitments. And we think that indeed we are facing many challenges, so many challenges lie ahead, but I think that the instruments are known, the strategy is known. What we need indeed is political commitment to move forward. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Touched on a lot of points. Very interesting. And finally, Mr. DeMarco. As we know, fiscal rules aim to provide stability and credibility, much like monetary rules do. And so from the perspective of a central bank, how do you see this tension between rules and discretion evolving within the fiscal sphere? And do the new rules offer sufficient space for macroeconomic stabilization?
Okay, sorry. I'll start from the latter question about the issue of macro stabilization. First of all, I think that the old framework basically suffered from complexity and lack of transparency. And it was very much disliked and I think distrusted by member states because it was based on the cyclically adjusted balance, which involved the calculation of a lot of unobserved variables, which only the European Commission could make and countries could not replicate, essentially. So basically, this is what led probably to the distrust and also to the lack of compliance, apart from the fact that the lack of compliance also probably arose because despite the existence of penalties on paper, in practice they were never enforced. So the way I see it, the new framework essentially sought to address two objectives in principle. One, to make the framework simpler and more efficient. And by more efficient, I mean that the framework would have better properties for macroeconomic stabilization. And the second was to address the issue of compliance, to improve compliance by making the framework appear more reasonable and more likely to be respected. Now, with respect to the first objective, the new framework, I think, is a step in the right direction, certainly, because the old one, as I said, was complex and did not sufficiently distinguish between the diverse fiscal situation of member states, and especially with respect to public debt levels. And the experience was that fiscal policies were essentially procyclical, and in the good times, basically were not exploited to create fiscal space. Now, the new framework essentially puts country-specific debt sustainability basically as the cornerstone of fiscal surveillance, and the net expenditure indicator as the sole basis for the fiscal adjustment part. And this, of course, helps to simplify and make the framework more transparent and allows for more flexibility with an adjustment part now extended from 4 to 7 years, which of course could help member states undertake long-term investment plans and structural reform. So it makes the framework more friendlier, let's say, with respect to macroeconomic stabilization. However, the safeguards that are in place are expressed in terms of structural balance, and they reintroduce effectively some complexity in the framework, although the coordinated use of national escape clauses, as was the case in the defense spending, provides some flexibility in that regard. Now, as regards to the second objective, that of improving compliance, which is very important under the new framework, the member states, of course in consultation with the European Commission, draw up their own medium-term fiscal plans. And as mentioned before, this should give greater national ownership than in the past. It is still early days, but I believe that this objective will remain a likely challenge. And earlier on in the previous panel, it was mentioned that 2024 was a transition year. And indeed, in 2024, the old rules, let's say, applied, but member states already knew about what the new rules were. And if you look at the European Commission compliance data or fiscal compliance data, between 21 and 2023, all both the low, medium, and high-risk countries in terms of debt sustainability all showed progress in the compliance indicator. But when you look at 2024, as was mentioned, there was a deterioration by those countries grouped in the medium and high risk for sustainability. And basically, when you dig deeper, the risk, as was mentioned, was coming from the expenditure benchmark, which will be the key compliance indicator for the new framework. So basically, this seems to suggest that both medium and high risk countries took advantage of the transition period by increasing their expenditure more than they sustainably should. And perhaps this was an anticipation that the new rules would not allow them to make such kind of expenditure. Basically, it's like telling someone that from 1st January you'll start a diet, and today you will go on food binging until 1st January arrives. Of course, there could have been other factors that come into play, like, for example, electoral cycles in certain countries, and also to avoid political crisis, for example, in countries which have coalition governments. And there could have been also some country specific factors. However, certainly this is not exactly a great start from a compliance perspective. Nevertheless, having said that, the new fiscal rules certainly offer more scope for macroeconomic stabilization than the previous one. And this is welcome from a central bank perspective. We all have memories of the sovereign debt crisis and its aftermath in Europe, where fiscal policy in many countries was very much constrained because of issues related to debt sustainability, and monetary policy for a long time was burdened with managing aggregate demand to stabilize the economy. Indeed, our previous president of the ECB had said, and I think it was really the case, that monetary policy at that time was the only game in town. Fiscal policy was completely absent, and with interest rates at the lower bound, basically we had to introduce new instruments, let's put it this way, unconventional monetary policy instruments in the form of asset purchases, basically to stimulate demand and reflate the economy. During the pandemic, the story was a bit different. Monetary policy continued to be highly stimulative. We also extended those asset purchases with new programs. Fiscal policy was also expansionary, but it was expansionary only because the rules were suspended, not because countries had effectively fiscal space. Now, the new rules definitely have elements that allow for a more counter-cyclical use of fiscal policy. And basically, I think the shift from rigid annual fiscal targets to more medium-term planning horizon should enhance the fiscal space. Secondly, the fiscal adjustment parts are based, as was mentioned earlier, on that sustainability analysis at the country level. So they are the adjustment parts are more carefully tailored to national economic conditions. The adjusted parts are also expressed in terms of net expenditure indicator, and so basically this reduces the risks of procyclical tightening during downturns. Also, the possible extension of the planning horizon from 4 to 7 years, provided, of course, countries commit to structural reforms and investment, encourages countries to maintain counter-cyclical investment spending. And finally, the use of national escape clauses also should lead to greater flexibility. So overall, these elements imply that countries have more leeway to use fiscal policy for stabilization. However, the reality remains that the scope to use fiscal policy for stabilization is limited in many EU member states by the high existing debt levels that they have. Besides, countries have to be careful in spending as well, and I believe that not all countries have gone for this escape clause, and probably it's because higher spending could also impact their debt servicing and the way credit rating agencies will look at these countries. And of course, in addition, the new framework still includes numerical safeguards on government deficits and debt, while of course EDP countries and EDP still require stricter adjustments. Now, I will tell about the first question which you asked about the tension between rules and discretion. Now, policy making always involves tension between the rules and discretion. But in the fiscal domain, I believe that rules are essential to prevent fiscal irresponsibility. More so in a monetary union with no common fiscal union, because there is always the incentive, let's say, for free riding. So rules are very important. It is often also thought that politicians often frame their decisions in terms of the electoral cycle and are often unwilling to tighten policy through unpopular measures. So basically, as was mentioned earlier, this imparts an upward bias to budget deficits. And in the euro area, the deficit bias may have an even stronger impact because the fiscal excesses of one member state could spill over those of other members by pushing up their borrowing costs. Rules are useful because they provide a clear anchor. They enhance transparency and reduces uncertainty for citizens and also for credit rating agencies and other market players. For example, if we take in the EU the threshold of the 3% deficit, the 60% debt, it's all very clear and ambiguous and widely known and much accepted. Moreover, I think the importance of EU rules, in particular in the EU 27, is important because it helps ensure equal treatment also with member states. However, of course, discretion is handy when economic conditions differ across countries. And rules, as was mentioned there, it could also become pro-cyclical, especially if we fixate with rigid targets that could lead countries to cut spending during downturns, for example. This was very evident in the crisis of 2008. The increased flexibility of the new fiscal framework, however, is an attempt, let's say, to allow for more discretion. Now, the balance between rules and discretion in the European governance framework is quite fragile, I would say, because the safeguards for debt reduction to ensure deficit resilience could end up overriding the flexibility embedded in the DSA approach. In addition, flexibility, as we said, is limited for countries in EDP, as they would need to follow the prescribed deficit reduction path. However, the flip side to that is that too much discretion would undermine the credibility of the framework, which could lead to increase market pressures, especially for the heavily indebted member states, and consequently that could rise their borrowing costs. Besides, also regarding behavior of consumer also raises the savings rates in expectation of future tax hikes when fiscal policy deviates from its rules. The enforcement of the new framework now needs to be tested. And in the past, enforcement has been quite, I would say, politically driven, with the Council being unwilling to take action against non-compliant members. So the first test of the framework will now come in 2026, when there will be the assessment of the results of the 2025. The first test comes for the new framework comes at a time of, let's say, when the geopolitical world has become very different from what it was a year earlier and when the new framework was agreed upon. The new US administration brought profound changes, which certainly could have been hardly contemplated, let alone anticipated. Now, the behavior of the new US administration essentially stems from their own fiscal realities, which is being tackled in a way that is essentially dismantling multilateralism. So that is the biggest change. If you look at the fiscal performance in the US between 2019 and 2024, on average, the annual deficit in the US was 8.1% of GDP per year, whereas in the EU it was just 3.6%. That is less than half as much as in the US. And in fact, also public debt in the US in 2019 was at 106% of GDP, and now it is 122%. That's an increase of 16 percentage points. And in the EU, it has risen from 77% to 81%. That's just 4 percentage points. That's a quarter of the increase in the US. So also here I want to make a caveat. I mean, when we see the faster economic growth in the US relative to the EU, we seem to forget that the EU is really on steroids with huge fiscal deficits, and it's also no wonder they have big current account deficits. Now, with the new US administration pledging tax cuts, which of course it wants to honor for the American electorate, and which would worsen effectively the fiscal situation, it has decided to an approach of fiscal consolidation through imposition of tariffs worldwide, including those on the EU, as well as retreating support to international organizations and foreign aid, and including military support here in Europe. Now, of course, with the military threats from Russia, which was escalated by the invasion of Ukraine, and more recently with the incursions in Poland and Estonia, of course, this has raised the security issue to a very high level, and at least the new framework was able to respond by let's say, allowing countries, for those who wish, to adjust their expenditures to cater for this new reality. So to conclude, overall, I would say that the existing framework does include some flexibility, which can cater for this geopolitical reality that we are living today. What the current framework needs, and this was mentioned earlier, is how to incorporate the infrastructure investment needs of the EU. The Draghi report was mentioned, and it was put that 800 billion would be needed in investment. So with the new framework focusing on expenditure, fiscal consolidation, of course, could lead to pressure on public investment. Investment plans, as was mentioned earlier, of EU countries show that over the next 3 years, investment is expected to increase by less than 0.2% of GDP. And investment in the EU overall is around 3.5% of GDP. So that's not much. As you mentioned earlier, there is this gap. So this is a challenge that needs to be addressed, especially in view of the investment needs in the green transition, digitalization, infrastructure to improve competitiveness. The way we see it is that the creation of a fiscal capacity with more issuance of common debt could be an avenue that could be better exploited. It perhaps was a missed opportunity with the last reform. Of course, we recognize that this is not easy to achieve politically, but creation of a safe asset that could be and more coordinated expenditure at the EU level with central fiscal capacity could also be enhance the macroeconomic stabilization properties of the framework. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can open the floor once again to questions. As usual, you know the drill now, concise. And if there's someone in particular you want to target, please obviously feel free to do so. Got the mic going around as well. We got Kevin, and then we'll take Professor.
Thank you for this interesting discussion. My simple question is, are we expecting too much from these rules? In reality, what you've been highlighting, particularly the first two speakers, is on the aspect of quality of public finances. Considering also the context of Europe at this point in time, where growth has been lacking, perhaps not in our case, but in most cases growth has been lacking, and growth not in the long term, in the short term, has been lacking for quite some time as well. So this makes it very challenging to follow fiscal rules. In the context of these constraints, and perhaps the need to focus not just on the quantity indicators, achieving a deficit or achieving a particular debt or growth in expenditure, but also what kind of expenditure do we need to strengthen growth again. I link to what the minister was saying, because this is ultimately crucial to make sure that ultimately, even in the long term, public finances are sustainable, and also from a political point of view, that these rules are credible. They are supporting Europe to achieve its long-term goals, particularly in the context of the challenges that you have all mentioned, that Mario Draghi has highlighted quite eloquently. This is my question to you.
Very good. I think we can take immediately your reactions.
Thank you. Yeah, so indeed, from my side, just to add that indeed I agree with you. As I already said, we have indeed competing objectives and basically very much competing priorities for the available funding that member states have. So the Portuguese experience has been very much, I would say, framed by our situation that you know that in a few years ago, many years ago, we had to ask for external support. So we entered a very demanding adjustment plan that has been very much still on the mind of everybody, that indeed this is something that we would not like to repeat. So this is an experience that is not to be repeated in our country. So I think that the authorities have been very much focused indeed on the quality of public finances, on managing fiscal policy in a very prudent way. Indeed, also if you compare our not very long ago history, we have indeed systematical deficits, and now for the past years we have been managing to have surpluses, which is something that indeed brings a lot of credibility also to public finances and also to the country. Rating agencies have been improving the Portuguese rating. So I think all in all, quality and quantity, we will have to find ways to manage fiscal policy in a way that allow us to keep prudent approaches, while obviously political changes, political choices are going to be difficult, but indeed keeping public finances sustainability as a priority, I think it needs to be the answer.
Yeah, if I can also say a few words, I mean, I fully agree with you with your very first question or comment that we shouldn't expect too much from fiscal rules in this regard, not least because certain fiscal rules about quantities. Now you also mentioned, also Paola mentioned the crucial thing of quality, which is, you know, very difficult to measure. I mean, for quality, there's also a quantitative concept to that. For example, whether spending on investment is maintained and increased and other current spending are reduced when, for example, there is a fiscal adjustment. But even within current spending, you know, if you look at a particular program, you know, supporting, you know, households or families, whether this is well targeted, that's also a major quality issue. So even within current spending and also within investment, there are major questions about what we can call quality. And indeed, fiscal rules which are about the big picture, you know, about the bigger aggregate numbers, they can't really go into those nitty-gritty details how you should do. But let me make some good news. I mean, in my first intervention, I was very pessimistic about whether investment targets can be reached. And I still remain skeptical about that. But in defense of the new rules, I think they make a lot of effort to try to encourage, for example, investment. Also, the professor mentioned that there are more than 50 times, you know, the investment is mentioned. Moreover, in one of our calculations, we compared what fiscal adjustment the new rules require and what the old rules would have required. And what we found that for about 1/3 of the countries, the requirements are broadly the same. But for the majority of countries, the new rules allow a more gradual, so less, first of all, they allow less fiscal adjustment. So the total adjustment need to be done is lower, and also allow it doing the more gradual because it can be done over 7 years. So these features of the new rules could foster higher public investment. So this is the good news, but unfortunately the bad news that I reported in my initial contribution, that despite that there is very limited planned increase in public investment. So I remain very much concerned whether all the competitiveness challenges that Europe faces would be addressed in a meaningful way in the coming years.
Just a small comment from my end. I think the point you raised about quality of expenditure is very important, and hopefully more compliance with the rules could hopefully push governments to try to achieve their targets through better quality expenditures. It's difficult to define, but I think the need to push to have better governance at the government level is clearly important to at least you know, to get more value for money from their expenditure. What is quality investment is very difficult to say. Even what is military expenditure is difficult to say nowadays. I mean, it's not just ammunition, tanks, and fighter jets, but investment in IT technologies and the cybersecurity. These are all investments which could be classified as as military spending as well. So the issue is that on definitions, it's difficult to pinpoint and to include in the framework quality expenditure. That would certainly make it more complex. Hopefully, the push for more compliance with the framework could compel governments, and especially if they have a strong governance framework in their expenditure program, to go for more quality expenditure to contain their fiscal, the quantitative numbers.
Very good. Thank you very much. We can go to Professor Janeba.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to come to one aspect that we touched upon but not focused so much on. That is the fact that the new governance framework allows for 4 to 5 year plans with an adjustment period up to 7 years. So this is a longer term horizon, and I think most of us, certainly economists, would welcome that for the reason that you were mentioning. You know, you can take a longer horizon towards public investment. It may help in stabilization, macroeconomic stabilization. But there's one aspect that concerns me, and that is the political commitment to these longer term plans. And to make it concrete, what about France and maybe other countries that are in very difficult political situations where it's not clear that the government survives even until next year, but now we have plans that go far into the medium to long-term future? So could that come back to us? I mean, that the thought of advantage that we would have with a longer-term horizon could come to be a disadvantage if the political stability is not given?
Very interesting question. Whoever wants to go first.
So, I mean, I think we can just agree with you that obviously the political commitment is essential, and certainly it's not just the rules which must guide fiscal policy, but much more a more general stability-oriented culture in the whole economy, which should ideally be shared by political parties, by various other institutions, the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Fiscal Council, and so on. So indeed, I mean, rules can't solve everything. There needs to be a stability-oriented political culture. But nevertheless, I do think that allowing longer horizon or longer duration for adjustment is sensible for two things. One is a more conceptual, that there are many governments in Europe which have not extraordinarily high public debts. I mean, Greece has the highest public debt at the moment, but it's also coming down rapidly. But there are a couple of countries over 100%, which is not yet at the Japanese level, but still the core concern. But there are many countries that say between the 60 and 90. And for these countries, I think public debt sustainability at the moment is not a major issue. So, German debt is currently 62% of GDP. Now, what if it goes to 70 or 80%? I mean, I think it would not undermine the credibility of the German government bond as the safest asset in Europe. And for such countries, if they want to spend on sensible things, and the German government wants to increase public investment and want to spend more on defense, I think this is absolutely welcome. And the rules somehow should foster that. But again, as you also mentioned, and we also will have soon a paper assessing the German fiscal plan in a way that a major fiscal contract.
So in a sense, there is in the new framework that incentive. There is that. Let's say there is an incentive, obviously, so delaying or for a more gradual fiscal adjustment, but committing to investments and reforms. Perhaps the question is, so there is some sort of incentive to go for quality as well in that aspect. But do you think, let's say, that incentive is enough, is going to be enough? Obviously, this is something we need to revisit 3-4 years down the road to see whether that has been sufficient incentive to go for more quality as well, and more investment as well. So it is part of quality as well. So I guess, I don't know what your opinion is. Probably we'll have to wait and see. But I would, perhaps it's important to reflect on that as well. Sort of, we tried in these new rules to try to put, at least create some sort of incentive, whether it's enough or not. Personally, I was initially quite skeptical, but the fact that a number of member states have applied for extension means that there was some form of incentive there.
Interesting. Any?
Maybe just a quick response. So indeed, a number of countries asked for a 7-year adjustment period, and they detailed what kind of investments and reforms they would like to do, which is a good thing. However, during the implementation and compliance assessment, only the net expenditure growth path will be formally monitored. Now, all countries will have to report what investment they did, and they might report, oh, sorry, we didn't do anything. But even if they report that, but keep the net expenditure path as it was approved by the council, then nothing happens. So the enforcement will only focus on expenditure growth, and indeed, you're right. We will see in 2-3 years from now whether all the promised investment will actually happen, or that will be the victim of fiscal adjustment.
Very good. That was a really interesting debate. Thank you very much to our speakers, Dr. Darbas, Dr. Ms. Costa, and Mr. DeMarco. Thank you very much for your interventions. A round of applause for them. So, very interesting session, I think. If there's one thing I would say is, if I had to talk about the implementation of the rules, it's mixed, as we would expect. It's an early stage, as we've already mentioned. We still have quite a way to go. It's only been a year and a half, but some very interesting observations already. I honestly, I loved something that you said. Rules can't solve everything. I think that is something we need to take away. There's not a magic wand. We're not going to solve all the problems of the world or the problems in Europe with rules, but it's important to evaluate everything. And we see, for example, even this last debate that we had, investment. Will these new rules hamper or will they encourage investment? I think even more broadly, will the new rules hamper or encourage our ability to deal with future shocks, but also maybe exploit future opportunities? I think that is an important thing, and something perhaps that wasn't mentioned but was alluded to also was the question of investments in not just in infrastructure but more broadly in the environment, in climate change. So if you, for example, Ms. Costa mentioned in Portugal special funds for extreme weather events, and that's almost reactive to what's happening out there, but perhaps more proactive measures related to adaptation, and those would be something that would be interesting. I also found very interesting, some of the speakers mentioned EU-wide funding mechanisms and EU-wide initiatives, which then touches upon the always thorny issue of EU federalism and what appetite is out there for EU federalism and this type of intervention, particularly even given the recent European Parliament elections, for example, and where things are going. But definitely an interesting debate that I think definitely needs to be had. So, very interesting debate. I think it's something where we're seeing, on the one hand, yes, more flexibility, more even simplicity, perhaps surprisingly. There has been, at least, there hasn't been an increase in complexity that perhaps we were expecting. But then, at the same time, how much flexibility is there for investment and for member states to really be able to, compete and push the competitiveness agenda forward, as we know we should be doing. So, very interesting, while keeping in mind we need fiscal discipline and we need credibility. So there's a lot to unpack. And I think this leads us very, very well into our next session. Our final session today, I know, it's gone by very quickly. Our final session brings things a little closer to home, because our final session deals with the new rules and how they impact small open economies, like Malta, like Greece, any other countries in the EU. And as we know, as we've heard already as well, small member states which are very open are highly integrated with financial systems, with economic systems, with trade, so therefore have particular vulnerabilities. And so how do these new rules take into account these vulnerabilities? This is a very important question about one size fits all. It always comes back to this issue of one size fits all. And obviously also research even has shown us that in small states, this tension between short-term adjustment and longer-term sustainability is perhaps even more magnified. And obviously there's a very limited ability to influence things internationally. So we really need to understand this and unpack it. And I mentioned we're bringing things closer to home, but I feel like these issues are very pertinent to many other countries, actually any country in the EU, because we live in a world that's very interconnected, very globalized, where really countries are extremely exposed to international shocks. And you can argue very limited ability to actually influence things in a meaningful way. So we have a lot to unpack, and joining me for the final session today, we've got an excellent trio of speakers. So we've got Mr. Lefteris Serkezis, Head of Macroeconomic Policy and Forecasting from the Ministry of Finance in Greece. Thank you very much. We've got Mr. Kevin Vella, Director General at the Economic Policy Department within the Ministry of Finance here in Malta. And finally, we've got Mr. Silvan Mifsud, who is the Deputy Chair of the Malta Chamber of Commerce, as well as a Director of EMCS Limited. So I'll start with you. Small open economies, so like Malta, like Greece, have these unique vulnerabilities when confronted with external shocks, and external shocks can be a wide variety of things. So it could be changes in terms of international demand. We've got also things like change in terms of trade, which we've seen also recently, and important sectoral shifts. So for example, if it's tourism or even transportation, which is obviously also very important sectors for us. And I guess these changes, which can be very rapid, will also lead to a commensurate rapid deterioration in the fiscal side of things, which can be very difficult to reverse quickly. So in your view, how well do the new EU fiscal rules strike this balance between, on the one hand, the need for credibility and discipline, which is again very pertinent for small countries, but then on the other hand, flexibility to deal with shocks? And I guess, is there a risk that these rules can, and automatic enforcement, I guess, can lead to pro-cyclical pressures and potentially problems with long-term sustainability?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Let me also offer the usual disclaimer. The views that I'm about to express do not necessarily represent the views, the positions of the Greek Ministry of Finance. Now, that being said, you are right that there are there is a number of reasons why small open economies like Greece and Malta are facing unique or vulnerabilities, or at least greater vulnerabilities compared to larger economic units. Now, without going into too much detail, some of these reasons I think are quite straightforward. I mean, these economies have practically no influence over international prices through domestic policies. They are much more sensitive to global financial developments and to the cycles in international capital flows. And very often, not always, but very often, due to the relatively limited internal market size, they are also reliant on a few specific sectors of the economy, which means that they have a lower resilience to cope with external events. Now, as a result, and as you already mentioned, this leads usually to a greater economic impact of various external shocks due to demand shifts or terms of trade, and this is also translated to a greater impact on the public finances, either due to the standard operation of automatic stabilizers, or very often because this creates a greater need for the governments to implement certain measures in order to support the economy, to support social cohesion in the face of these challenges. Now, you mentioned Greece and Malta, you mentioned transportation and tourism, and the example of our countries during the pandemic is a very clear one. I mean, if you look at the data, both Greece and Malta had a very deep recession, much deeper than the EU average, and they also had a much worse deterioration in the fiscal balance compared to the average for the euro area or the EU. And this was to a great extent because of our economy's reliance on sectors like shipping and tourism. Now, this is, of course, this was a very extreme example. This was a very dramatic case, but the argumentation, I think, holds even in less dramatic events. So it does not have to be so extreme as the pandemic in order to see this greater influence and greater sensitivity of small open economies. One of the reasons why this is relevant for the implementation of fiscal rules has to do with the comment you made about the automaticity or non-automaticity of enforcement. What I understand by automaticity is when enforcement is decided on the basis of some simple or perhaps not so simple numerical rule. There can be plenty of such rules. You can have rules about the size of the deficit or about the change in the deficit or the size of the change in the debt. I mean, there can be many variations. The important thing I would like to emphasize is that in all these cases, if such enforcement arrangements are introduced automatically, there is a risk, as you implied in your question, that small open economies, which are usually the countries that are hit the hardest by an external shock, will always be the countries that will be called to take stronger adjustment measures, perhaps immediately or at least in a very short horizon, in order to address this challenge. So there is this risk of procyclicality to the extent that the several rules, the fiscal rules, whatever their exact form might be, are enforced in a very automatic manner. Now, all the above arguments are pointing to the need for some flexibility or perhaps some greatest consideration of flexibility in the case of small open economies. I would like to stress that the balance with credibility, as you said, has to be maintained, and that's not just this is not just a rhetorical device. It's a very strict truth, because if we're talking about small open economies, there are other features that characterize them that may actually be pointing to the opposite direction. That is, to the direction of a stronger fiscal discipline or of a stricter adherence to the rules. I mean, to mention just two examples, small open economies are usually more reliant on international capital markets for debt issuance, for debt refinancing. So the perception of the markets is very important. Second point, that very often, exactly due to the smallness of the economy and due to their openness, due to their close integration to international trade patterns, small open economies are sometimes characterized by greater demand leakages. So if you have a fiscal expansion in order to address a negative shock, there is perhaps in these cases a greater risk that the impact on economic activity will be relatively weaker and the impact on the current account will be relatively stronger and in the wrong direction. So this is a balance that we really need to upkeep when designing policies and when we are talking about the fiscal rules. Now, to turn to the core of your question about the new fiscal framework, and let me distinguish about the philosophy of the new framework and about the operational arrangements. On the philosophy of the new framework, I would note two things. The first is what previous speakers have already mentioned, and this is this shift from a debt rule that was horizontal and that was implemented across the board to fiscal rules and fiscal targets that are derived through country-specific analysis of debt sustainability, which takes into account the specificities of each particular country and the specific challenges and risks, and as Kevin implied before, even the specific history of economic development and challenges in this country. So I will not speak more about that because this is clearly a very important step in the right direction. The second part about the philosophy is something that also existed in the previous fiscal rules, and it had to do with this idea that enforcement procedures should not be implemented automatically. This goes back to what we were talking about before. So it had always been a part of the fiscal framework that whenever some fiscal rule is breached, the decision about further enforcement measures would have to rely on a much broader assessment, not just on a numerical criterion that might be breached. And as I said, this was part of the previous rules. It is part of the current rules. So I think there is quite a consensus that this philosophy is the one that is appropriate. Now, on the more operational aspects of the new framework, this flexibility that is perhaps needed, especially for small open economies, it can be found in several provisions. We have the possibility for member states to request an extended adjustment period through in which they will perform the fiscal adjustment that is necessary. We have the possibility for member states to revise their plans in case where there are objective developments that make their implementation very difficult. And of course, we also have the national escape clause, which allows member states to deviate from the paths, even for reasons that do not have to do with the economic downturns in the EU as a whole, but with more country-specific asymmetric shocks. Now, all this shows that, at least in theory, the new framework does have a philosophy and specific operational arrangements that seem to be compatible with this idea that we were talking about, this required balance between discipline and flexibility. I would like to stress, however, the great importance of implementation, because in theory it is true that there are some important ingredients there, but many things will depend on how they will be implemented in practice. To mention just a few words about the national escape clause. It is kind of a new provision, but it is true that the previous framework also had a number of flexibility provisions. They did exist. They were used very, very rarely. It turned out in practice that their activation was extremely difficult. And if one makes an overall assessment, I think that their contribution to the flexibility of the previous framework had not been really significant. Now, so how should flexibility clauses like that be used? I mean, obviously, the use should be cautious, for reasons that have already been mentioned. But it's mainly because we don't want to undermine the credibility of the framework. It should not be too cautious as to lead to situations where perhaps some flexibility can be provided only in the aftermath of truly catastrophic developments. So there is a balance to reach there. And I think that there are some elements in the recent activation of the national escape clause for defense spending that seem to point to the right direction, because on the one hand, we have, in this specific case, we have seen a willingness to recognize the importance of the problem and the urgency, and also the impact that member states would have on their public finances if they went along and increased defense spending. At the same time, we had some arrangements that seem to offer that balance that's necessary. For instance, there is a cap, right? You have flexibility to spend more, but up to a point. There is some delimitation of the spending that you can't do in breach of the ceiling. So this recent activation, I think, it does point to a way where on the one hand we will have a great willingness to recognize the problem and respond to it quite fast, quite quickly, while at the same time having some arrangements that ensure that credibility will remain. On the other issues that I mentioned, let me just a few words. I mentioned the possibility that member states have to require an extension of the adjustment. A small note I would make on that is that, as you know, and as other speakers have already said, this extension has to be accompanied by commitments on reforms and investment. It could be useful, it is just an idea, it could be useful if member states were encouraged, especially small open economies, if they were encouraged in situations like that to also focus on reforms and investments that tend to strengthen their resilience. And especially the resilience in relation to these special vulnerabilities that small open economies are facing that I mentioned in the beginning. I think that The framework places a lot of emphasis on sustainability and potential growth, as it should. That's obviously correct. But perhaps this should not overshadow the importance of resilience-oriented reforms, especially in the case of small open economies. And finally, about the implementation of revisions to the plans, I think that it is important that when the framework is implemented in practice, we keep a quite broad interpretation of what we mean by objective difficulties, because obviously it is not entirely clear which are the situations where member states will have this possibility. But it would be good, it could be useful, especially for small open economies, if we don't adopt a very strict definition of this term. It will also be useful if we have cases where member states, when faced with some negative shock, can request a revision of the plan, which will also be accompanied by an extension of the period, of the adjustment period, even if the original plan did not have an extended adjustment. My understanding is that there is nothing against it in the fiscal rules, but this is not a legal framework issue. I'm talking about issues that might emerge during the implementation, and choices will have to be made. And finally, it will be important to have some recognition of the fact that speed in such cases is of the essence. So it would be good if we could ensure that revisions of member states' plan are fast enough to allow for a timely policy response when it is needed. And let me mention just one very final remark, just 15 more seconds. These points and these arguments, I think they are relevant to the situation of small open economies under all circumstances, or at least under most conceivable circumstances. I think they become even more relevant and perhaps more difficult to address in practice under circumstances like the ones that we're having today, circumstances characterized by increased trade fragmentation and more pronounced protectionist trade policies internationally. So most of the vulnerabilities of small open economies stem from the fact that they are exposed to the international environment. And now we are talking about an exposure to a more difficult environment, to a more dangerous environment. So all these issues become, I think, they acquire a greater relevance. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. Very, very interesting. I think you touched upon a lot of points there, and I think we're going to have an interesting debate afterwards all about this. Kevin, I'll get to you. So obviously we know and we've heard quite a lot about the challenges that small member states face, open economies who are very integrated within, I guess, trade systems, of course, internationally, but also when it comes to financial flows. And that means that perhaps in terms of risk, apart from, as we heard already, changes to maybe terms of trade, whatever, but also potentially at risk of capital flight, which would be an issue here. Now, I guess the question is, in your view, how do the rules tackle that? So do you think the rules strike the right balance between obviously giving credibility and then obviously giving discipline, that is obviously very important, but then also these longer term issues and also the ability to adapt and be able to perhaps treat crises as they come along, and especially for small member states, this might be a big issue.
Yes. Thank you for this opportunity, first of all. The theme here is the relevance of fiscal rules for small open economies like Malta, like Greece, like other smaller member states. And at this point in time, we focus a lot on the trade issue because that's a big challenge at the moment. But as you rightly point out, small open economies are mostly also integrated financially. We depend a lot on capital inflows, which finance our investments, and that is the basis of our economies most of the time. And this is quite important. If we look at the last financial crisis, particularly in Europe, particularly how it evolved in Europe after 2009, 2011, if you recall, what originally started from, let's say, the US, eventually fed into Europe, and it was much more prolonged in Europe, actually, the crisis. And at the time, the diagnosis of that problem in Europe was like it's what in international macro we call a first generation fiscal crisis. Okay, that's how it was treated. It's even up to this day called the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. So it's a problem of debt, of public debt, of sovereign debt. And that's how it was diagnosed. And consequently, the treatment at the time was to undertake a fiscal consolidation effort, increase taxes, reduce spending. In certain crisis situation, member states had to sell their own assets. And unfortunately, the idea there was treating it that way. The idea is to focus on fiscal consolidation, or at the time called austerity, to try to re-establish confidence. And for small open economies, the issue of confidence is very important, obviously, because in reality, one of the reasons why we need fiscal rules is to ensure that there is sufficient confidence to invest in our own economies. However, the problem there is that that confidence never materialized, because in reality, the problem was not a fiscal problem. It became a fiscal problem eventually, but the basis of the problem was more a question of the capital flows from the core of Europe to the periphery. Those flows were quite significant at the time, and it was creating a lot of macroeconomic imbalances, particularly imbalances in terms of credit growth, the increase in credit growth in the periphery of Europe. In many cases, it went to the private sector, but even to the public sector. That credit growth inflated asset prices, whether it was property prices, whether it was the price of bonds, sovereign bonds. It reduced at the time, prior to the crisis, the spreads. There was an underappreciation of risk at the time preceding that crisis. And obviously that build-up of macroeconomic imbalances, eventually when the asset price bubbles burst, obviously that had a big impact on public finances. But even looking before that, so the build-up of those imbalances was in stimulating the price of those assets, was also stimulating tax revenue. So many of the economies which found themselves into fiscal problems later, actually before, were regarded as exemplary. So the fiscal rules at the time, remember that we had fiscal rules at the time as well, weren't actually designed sufficiently, they weren't designed good enough to identify these imbalances and compel these member states to save the extra tax revenue for potential recession or crisis in the aftermath. So my invitation here is to, looking back at that experience, is that many a times we tend to focus on the fiscal aspect, when in reality the main problem, and in that case I think it was a balance of payments problem. And at the time, the rules that we had didn't capture this sophistication. The rules that we have now do much better in that aspect. First of all, in going for the expenditure rule, the net expenditure rule, that's already trying, because that limits expenditure to your potential growth. Potential growth is less susceptible to asset price bubbles. So the idea there is to ensure that any extra revenue which a country is getting possibly from the build-up of imbalances is actually saved and creates more fiscal space for the eventuality of a crisis. That is one aspect which has improved. The previous framework that we had before, which was based on the output gap, that output gap is not immune from these asset price bubbles. It doesn't show up in the output gap, so basically it was not being compensated. With this new rule, and then I think this was a major improvement, already creates more the possibility of creating more fiscal space. The second important development in the new framework is the debt sustainability analysis, which, as I have said before, doesn't just look at your potential growth, but also looks at the past history, including history of crisis in the past. And you have to stabilize your debt sufficiently, even in the possibility that a crisis materializes. So you have to sufficiently diminish your debt, so in that possibility, your debt remains stable. So I think this is a substantial improvement from the previous framework, which in a sense creates more stability. Obviously, it doesn't prevent the build-up of macroeconomic imbalances. And here I would like to go back to the reforms that were undertaken back in 2011 and 2013, just after the crisis, just after the financial crisis. And one of those reforms was actually the constitution of what we today call the macro imbalance procedure. What is this macro imbalance procedure? It's a sort of early warning system which looks at the build-up of macroeconomic imbalances. So member states who are building dangerous macroeconomic imbalances can be identified, and obviously, if that is the case, then there are usually a number of recommendations, including the country-specific recommendations, to address those imbalances. So we have two procedures here. We have the fiscal procedures, the excessive deficit procedures, but there is also this macroeconomic imbalance procedure. Unfortunately, they still remain distinct, the two procedures. There is an element of linking today with the extension of the framework, because that requires structural reforms which could address also these imbalances, but still the two frameworks remain quite distinct. And one thing I would suggest, and which would be particularly relevant for small open economies, because they are very much integrated in global capital flows, which make them more vulnerable to these build-up of macroeconomic imbalances, is a more direct link between these two frameworks. Now, what I would suggest here is, although I'm talking about small open economies, in reality, I think this is also relevant for bigger economies, because, as you said before, even the biggest economy in the EU, in the global arena, it's still an open economy. It's still a relatively small in the sense that it cannot completely determine, as Lefteris was suggesting, all the market forces. So it remains dependent on what is happening abroad. Now, I would link this also to the competitiveness agenda of Europe at the moment, particularly to going back to what Mario Draghi was highlighting, the need and the investment needs of Europe, which are quite significant. Mario Draghi mentions 5% of GDP per annum, that's 800 billion per annum, to address the investment needs of Europe. And this is before the new Trump administration. So this was before we realize that we need to increase also our spending on defense and on our security. So the investment needs are huge. Now, one thing which we know about Europe is that it generates significant savings. Europe as a whole generates a current account surplus. And in the private sector, significant savings are generated in Europe. So potentially there is a source of financing for these investments, and this is where the private and the public need to come together. Unfortunately, at the moment, those savings are not financing the competitiveness challenges of Europe. They're flowing abroad and financing the competitiveness of other countries, including the US, ultimately. So what Mario Draghi is suggesting is that we need Europe to attract back those savings back into Europe to finance our competitiveness agenda, our innovation agenda, to finance our defense spending, our security. Now, if you think of these as, in a sense, requiring those savings to come back to Europe, that means, again, an inflow of capital from abroad. And these would go not just toward the small member states like Malta and Greece, but they need to go even in the larger member states, which is an opportunity for Europe to invest, but also a challenge, because with significant capital inflows coming back, there is an increased risk of the buildup of macroeconomic imbalances. If you think of the Draghi report, what is it advocating? It is actually advocating the need for more risk-taking. Measured risk-taking, it's important that it is measured, but unless it starts risking more, it will never be able to invest in innovation and improve its competitiveness. But obviously, the fact that we need to take on board more risk is more risk. So the importance here, that's why I think the importance of the macroeconomic imbalance procedure and why it should be linked to the fiscal rules as well. And how can we do this? Given that we've just reformed our fiscal framework, is it time to change it again? Perhaps there are simple ways of doing this. And I go back to the debt sustainability analysis here. One of the aspects of the analysis there is the stochastic simulations, which basically simulate the possibilities of different vulnerabilities in the economy materializing. And we attach a probability, it is set arbitrarily at 70%, so we need to be confident that the debt can be reduced with 70% confidence. That assumption, that seemingly assumption, obviously will determine the pace of growth of net expenditure in every member state, but it is a uniform assumption at the moment. One thing we could do is we link that assumption, that 70% probability, change it depending on whether a member state has significant macroeconomic imbalances. If, on the other hand, it doesn't, we could allow for a lower probability. But if a member state is subject to more significant macroeconomic imbalances, that could be increased. So it would literally change the net expenditure growth requirements of the member state subject to these macroeconomic imbalances. Probably that doesn't require any legislative changes, so it's something which could be considered. And in that way, link the two together, because I think in the future, in the coming future, this will become a more important issue. There could be other mechanisms contemplated, but probably those require more legislative changes. For example, linking the macro imbalance procedure with the resilience safeguards, which are in the rules themselves, but that would probably be more difficult to implement. But the first one, I think it should be achievable. The point here to make is that intrinsically Europe needs to go into a period of more risk taking, and so we need tools to address those risks, not to stifle them because we need to undertake more risk, but make sure that it is a calculated risk.
Very interesting points there, even technical and then also broader, almost cultural, about the need for more risk-taking. So finally, Silvan, I'll get you. So obviously fiscal rules are often discussed in high technical terms, as we've seen also today, but ultimately their impacts are probably felt most keenly by businesses, and particularly SMEs and family-owned businesses. And I guess this is especially important in small member states where these small businesses form the backbone of the economy. And to be fair, even across Europe, not just in small businesses, in small countries, but even in larger countries. But nonetheless, from your experience working very closely with these businesses, how do fiscal rules influence the private sector investment decisions, especially and competitiveness and growth? Positively and negatively. And in your view, what features should a fiscal framework include to ensure that it supports investment, capacity building, investing in people, investing in innovation that is very necessary for SMEs and even renewal, I guess?
Okay, let me be more simple as I like to sort of think out things on a personal basis. In my humble opinion, and as outlined by previous speakers, Europe has a competitiveness problem. I like very much to comment that rules will not be the solution for our problems. If we have been efficient in anything in Europe is in dishing out rules, and yet this is where we are. The problems we face today, even using the France example, okay, France increases debt, but its primary source of the problem was its abysmal economic growth figures for the past years, which led it to where it is today. So dealing, in my humble opinion, dealing with competitiveness and the competitiveness of European economies should be the prime goal of the European project going forward if this project is to survive. So basically, we have a blueprint today, which is mentioned by previous speaker, is the Draghi report, and making sure that we implement all that needs to be implemented to achieve European Union competitiveness, the economies of the European Union become more competitive and have sustainable and much larger growth than we had in the past years is extremely, extremely important. Said that, obviously, I see that this change in the fiscal governance framework is a move to make sure that fiscal policy is much less of a hindrance to achieve economic growth into the future, based on the past experience, as Kevin was sort of explaining the trajectory and what we've experienced from the financial crisis onwards. However, obviously, it will not be enough. And I very much subscribe to the point of view of what the Deputy Governor mentioned, that, as Draghi himself alluded, the need for common safe assets to finance the revolution needed and the investment needed in certain areas to bring competitiveness back to the European economies is very much a necessity rather than an option, in my humble opinion. Now, back to the macro level, because this was sort of a general comment of all that I've heard for the past hour and a half or so. With regards SMEs and family businesses, well, what do SMEs and family businesses want? They want, first of all, to make sure that this framework creates a fiscal space, although, as I already mentioned, I highly doubt that the fiscal space will be enough on its own for any country on its own to do the necessary investments that are needed, and that is why the safe assets and the common European debt. But they want to make sure that the investments are being done in those strategic areas, those growth-enhancing areas, which will be needed in order to make sure that they are competitive on the global stage. That is the number one priority of any business person involved in the economy, as an operator in the economy. So obviously we're speaking about digital infrastructure, renewable energy, education and skills. We still have a huge skills mismatch problem in Europe, which is one of the pillars of the lack of competitiveness we still face in various economies. We ultimately, and a business would want that we do not face situations where fiscal discipline comes at the cost of long-term growth. So that is obviously one of the main targets, which I think even the new governance framework is trying as much as possible to achieve. I would go down the route as much as possible to possibly include the possibility of ring-fencing public investment or public incentives in areas critical for Europe's future competitiveness to give stability and peace of mind to businesses, that whatever the cyclicality of European economies, these expenditures and these investments will remain there. Obviously, we need to incentivize the private sector. So incentivizing the private sector much stronger in research and development and innovation remains key through tax credits, grants, or possibly even more simplified and centralized tax regimes for even startups and small businesses to, first of all, lower entry barriers, but also encourage new investments. It's extremely important. A second pillar, which I think is important from any fiscal governance framework, is agility. There were very much, the new framework tries to respond to this through building more flexibility. We mentioned the escape clause, when you need a temporary deviation from the rules due to exceptional circumstances, and also the counter-cyclical tools. Obviously, I would go even further, that agility is not just something to be considered in a major situation like the global pandemic. But agility is also needed in responding to changes we're seeing, not just on a geopolitical stage, but also on a technological front. I believe we are living a technological revolution. Some have compared it again to the past industrial revolution, a revolution which will bring with it huge changes, not only in the composition of our economies, but in the composition of our labor market, so on and so forth. And monitoring this revolution and then including it as a possible need for flexibility and increased investment is extremely important. The pace of change is so fast that we can hardly miss this bus in Europe. We can hardly become, yet again, unfortunately, as spectators to other non-European players who dominate the space at our expense. Thirdly, what businesses want is obviously still have accountability and coherence, in the sense that, first of all, they need to make sure that there is fiscal resilience. Notwithstanding the flexibility and everything, they cannot pass through situations we have passed and certain economies and certain member states have gone through. And as much as possible, have oversight on the fiscal trajectory of countries, which is as much as possible shielded from political interference, which builds automatically trust with the private sector. This is very difficult, I know, almost impossible, but allow me to dream. Finally, policy coherence. Any fiscal framework must be cohesive with all other policies. So whether it's labor market regulation, trade policy, an efficient legal system, because as Kevin said, even if we address macroeconomic imbalances, even if we have the best fiscal regulatory framework, governance framework we can think of, that will not necessarily achieve the desired results of having competitive European economies. And that means that we have to look at the bigger picture, whether protecting intellectual property, promoting technological transfer, whatever needs to be done in order to make sure that all our resources at European level, and especially even at our level with regards to small and open economies, are actually being maximized in order to achieve the goal of competitiveness in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. So now we can open the floor to discussion for the last time. Please be concise, and we have a microphone as well. So if you have comments, we have Dr. Catania there.
So first of all, thank you to all the speakers. It was a very interesting discussion. From my side, it's more of a comment rather than a question. I think there have been various points saying that the new fiscal framework is a step in the right direction, but it cannot solve all the problems. So it's not a solution for all the problems. And I think there's only so much that we can expect from any fiscal rule. So what's the aim of a fiscal rule, whether it's a national fiscal rule, expenditure, debt, deficit? It's that of providing a credible anchor for fiscal sustainability. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and also so not expect too much from also the new framework, while of course ensuring that the new rule does not jeopardize public investment, it does not stifle economic growth. But we cannot, for example, expect that the new fiscal rule, the new fiscal framework will encourage more investment to the tune of what's expected or what's being proposed in the Draghi report. So I think what's more of a concern from my personal opinion is that most of the problems that we've mentioned, so the need for EU investment, macroeconomic stabilization. There was also, I think, the point by Kevin, the comparison between the US and the EU debt levels, etc. They all require action at an EU level, which we know what the solutions are, but it seems that it's very difficult to, in practice, agree on these solutions. So in terms of investment, I think it's very clear that there needs to be investment that's financed at an EU level, so a bigger EU budget. I think in terms of macroeconomic stabilization also, it's very clear that we need a central fiscal capacity at the euro area level. Again, something very difficult to get agreement upon. And the final point, I think the comparison between the US and the EU, yes, in the US the debt is higher, but within the EU and also within the euro area, it's not national governments that are borrowing. So even there, there have been various proposals for euro bonds, etc., and common debt issuance in whatever form. But again, it's very difficult to get agreement. So I think this is the main problem, that we know what the solutions are, but in practice, the political will for more European integration, I think, is not there.
Any reactions from the panel?
I mean, the Draghi report is already 1 year old. So time and dust is collecting on this report. I mean, Draghi himself seems to be losing hope. I mean, if you listen to his speech on the 28th of August at the Rimini conference, he said quite blatantly, for someone like Draghi, that it seems that Europe has chosen the path, or is likely to be choosing the path, of a slow death, or a slow, irrelevant death of irrelevance. I think it is a matter of when the negatives of non-action become so big that the only option of action, whatever, notwithstanding the difficult decisions that need to be taken and whatever, the imbalance becomes so lopsided that action and the difficult decision Moira was referring to become the only option way forward. Obviously, there are other issues at stake from a political perspective. I mean, influences of the far right. I know the minister mentioned this in his opening speech, because obviously the world there are many variables happening around us. I still hope that ultimately leadership and good sense prevail, that the inevitable becomes agreed upon by so many, that notwithstanding no union and no relationship of what type, even a simple marriage, let alone a union, a European union of a commercial political union, an economic political union, there are negatives and positives, and ultimately everyone realizes that the positives far outweigh the negatives to go down the path of further integration across all levels.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel?
Just a small comment. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the fiscal rules are about anchoring fiscal policy, or about correcting for the deficit bias. Now we want them to do it without intervening too much into investment decisions in an adverse manner, and without leading to pro-cyclical policies, obviously. But there is obviously a very strict limit to what they can do. Mostly when we're talking about investment, and when we're talking about the great challenges of the union that you faced, I mean, the contribution of the fiscal rules is more of a negative manner, right? We don't want them to get into the way, right? And so we want to achieve these things while maintaining some sustainability, but not having rules that will prevent us from achieving our goals, right? And as to your comments about the need for difficult but necessary decisions with respect to EU integration in order for this all these challenges to be faced, I fully agree. I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kevin?
Just a small point, as I have highlighted as well, and as Moira has highlighted, there's a limit to how much fiscal rules can address everything, obviously, and it's not possible. Obviously, one of the main objectives of fiscal rules is to ensure that sustainability. And as economists, we know that the evolution of that depends on primarily the growth interest differential. And one area where the fiscal rules directly impact is the interest component. By enhancing credibility of policy, it tries to prevent markets from speculating against the credibility of government. And it is an important area. That's why we think, and we all agree, that rules are important. On the second aspect, on the growth aspect, perhaps we're agreeing that there is a limit. So, as Lefteris pointed out, we try to avoid fiscal policy from, first of all, being in the way of growth. But at the same time, the fact that it increases credibility should stimulate, should help, let's say, the private sector to invest because there's a more resilient environment, let's say. So it can address that in this way. We have discussed a lot the role of public investment and of quality of public finances, which perhaps we focused a lot on public investment, but there are other elements of government expenditure which also promote long-term growth, not just investment, and even the investment itself. The quality obviously matters as well. So, but there's a limit to how much fiscal rules themselves can influence that. But ultimately, we're talking about fiscal policy, about budgets. And budgets are the main tool of government, at least from a government's point of view, to influence also the growth paradigm. So that's why all these objectives, eventually we still discuss, even though we discuss fiscal rules, we're discussing the budget, ultimately. And that matters a lot for economies. Again, just to repeat one thing, we shouldn't forget the private as well. So the private sector, which also is supporting the economy, and that is with also the risk that that brings upon. So that was my invitation this morning to also make sure that we have rules which cater for that risk as well.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Any comments? No, if we do not have any, then thank you very much to this panel. Thank you very much for your participation. Very interesting. So that's our morning done and dusted. I hope you enjoyed the very lively debate. You know, I mentioned initially that rules can make you queasy. Well, given the quality of the discussions, I feel that rules have never been more exciting than they have been today. We've talked about a lot of different things. I know I stand between you and lunch outside, so I'm going to be very brief. I think one thing that really emerged is this trend, at least in the reform, has been towards, yes, ensuring discipline and ensuring credibility, but also towards more flexibility. I think we cannot deny that it has emerged. And flexibility both in terms of across countries, so across different country requirements, which is very important, different sizes, different points in their cycle, but then also temporal. So over time, this thing that a reform today must still be valid a year and a half from now, 2 years from now. And then having the built-in flexibility to be able to adapt as we go along. I think that has been a very important point. If I had to summarize something across all different sessions, how the rules need to integrate with our broader goals as an EU. And perhaps I am biased because I come from this sphere, but there's one target that's common across everything, that's sustainability. Sustainability in terms of economic sustainability, which then embeds the fiscal, but then also the environmental side, and we can't forget the social. It's extremely important. And yes, I completely agree with Dr. Catania that we cannot expect too much. This is not a miracle. We're not going to expect the fiscal rules to change everything, but they do bake in a lot of incentives which are extremely important for our sustainability. I really enjoyed, for example, what Silvan was mentioning, because we didn't really talk about digitalization, for example, and how rapidly things are changing. And therefore, we need to have the incentives in there so that we do not stifle both public and also private investment in digitalization. As he was speaking, he was talking about the rapid change of things like never before. I was thinking about when I was young, and the big disruptive technology when I was young, when it comes to, like in primary school, the big technology that changed the way we did assignments and homework was Encarta. I don't know if you remember Encarta, sort of summarizing all of the encyclopedias into one CD-ROM. Yes, that was innovation back then. Nowadays, it's completely different. It's on a completely different level, and it's only going to get even more so. And that's just one example, just how rapidly things are changing. And therefore, within the context of also fiscal rules, they need to be able to adapt. And that is something that I think we need to take with us moving forward. Obviously, also, again, credibility is something that we need to treasure and we need to really emphasize without hampering our future sustainability. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone, our speakers, our audience members for being so great and for your questions. And also thank you to those who are following us online. I hope you've taken a lot of interesting points. This has been a very interesting discussion. And to bring it back to Bruegel's 20th anniversary, I would like to end with this, that Bruegel has been involved very heavily in research in this field. Long may it continue, because if there's one thing we need is policy that's based on evidence and on really solid research. And I hope that these discussions have inspired perhaps Bruegel to undertake even more research in this area, but also others here to undertake research in this field. Thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.